Hey, you guys, welcome to Addictive Personalities. My name is Bethany, and this podcast is based on lived experience, not professional advice. We're talking all things addiction, mental health, trauma, and healing, and everything in between. Please be mindful of where you are in your own journey, as some content may be triggering. This is a safe space without judgment, a space where raw honesty is celebrated. So if you're here, you're in the right place. Hey guys, welcome back. This is a continuation of our previous episode around boundaries. And, in the last episode, I just kind of laid the groundwork of what boundaries meant to me and how I've learned and am still learning about boundaries, what they are not, the feelings around boundaries, and how boundaries actually really contribute to a true path of healing and self-worth. So let's dive into it a little deeper. In this episode, we're going to talk about what boundaries are not. We need to clear some shit up around it because right now, boundaries are being thrown around just like the word trigger, like a buzzword and a trend. And you'll hear it come up, in TikTok videos and with your therapist. And honestly, I don't think that people truly understand the gravity of boundaries and what they mean in the space of addiction recovery. It's a lot different for people who have experienced or subjected themselves to long-term and sustained trauma. It's a lot different than growing up in a particular family dynamic, which makes you a people pleaser, right? Which doesn't mean you're actually dealing with trauma in that respect. So for people like that, it may be just different. I don't want to say that it would be easier or harder. I can't speak for anybody else, but I can imagine that having survived traumatic experiences actually really changes the brain and the brain's ability to accept one's value. So a lot of people are using the word without actually doing the work. And if you're in recovery, especially early recovery, misunderstanding boundaries doesn't just keep you stuck, it keeps you confused, resentful, and even second guessing yourself. So let's talk about what boundaries are not. A boundary is not a demand. If your boundary sounds like you need to stop doing this, that's not a boundary. That's you trying to control someone else's behavior because you don't yet trust yourself to respond. It's actually kind of like a threat or a warning. A real boundary sounds like, if this happens, I will remove myself. One is about power, the other is about personal responsibility, and recovery is about learning the difference. And I have made this very mistake. So you're not alone if this is you. I've probably made all of these mistakes and am still working on them. So a boundary is also not an ultimatum. Okay, ultimatums are emotional grenades. Boundaries are quiet and firm. If you're saying, if you don't change, I'm done, but you don't actually know if you'll follow through, that's not a boundary. That's desperation dressed up as strength. And again, boundaries aren't threats, they're decisions. A boundary is not over explaining yourself. This one hits hard for people like myself in post addiction because many of us have learned to justify our needs. We have had to prove we deserved space. We're conditioned to explain, defend, and negotiate our limits. So we ramble, we overtalk, we trauma dump. I do this a lot. And here's the truth. If you need a 5-minute explanation, you're probably asking for permission and not setting a boundary. Clarity doesn't require storytelling. It's very cut and dry. A boundary is also not a silent treatment. And I've been guilty of this. It's happened to me. Disappearing, ghosting, withdrawing to punish someone, that's not a boundary. That's avoidance wrapped in self-righteousness. It's not about grace. It's not about correcting behavior or establishing a clear expectation. It's about making somebody feel something when you do that. It's about punishing someone. And what boundary setting is about making a choice for yourself and being honest about it. A boundary is not using therapy language as a weapon either. Phrases like, you're violating my boundaries, or you're triggering me, which we talked about, or you're toxic to my energy. These are all really mainstream therapy words that actually quite lose their meaning because when we're using toxic as everything that's bad, it's losing its meaning. We all know what real toxicity is. We lived it in addiction codependence. We lived it in lowering our standards and surrounding ourselves with people who didn't have our best interest in mind. It's a cycle, and you can't just label someone toxic because they have normal human behaviors like selfishness or being rude, right? Again, these terms and these phrases mean absolutely nothing without behavior attached to them. Boundaries are not labels, they are actions. If nothing changes after you say the word, the boundary doesn't exist. And like I said before, a boundary is not a punishment. And this matters a lot in recovery because some of us confuse empowerment with retaliation. Listen, we have had a lot to endure during our addiction. We've seen things that we wish we could forget. And sometimes we over dramatize or we over exaggerate our own feelings and we retaliate. And we'll get into that a little bit as well. But boundaries aren't about teaching someone a lesson, they are not retaliatory. They are not about winning. They are not about being right. They're about choosing not to participate in something that harms you. No drama required. Doesn't have to be some memorable, crazy outburst or statement through action. Okay, that's actually really toxic behavior. So if we go back to the previous point about stating something like, this is toxic for me or you're toxic, actually is pretty toxic. A boundary is also not about controlling access to yourself emotionally. And this might be uncomfortable to hear. Some people use boundaries to avoid intimacy, accountability, or repair. That's not self-protection, that's armor. Okay, so that is a trauma response and it is completely understandable. But you have to recognize this by yourself. Understanding what are not boundaries will help you understand what are. And so we have to shed that armor. We have to become more vulnerable, and that takes time. So healthy boundaries don't shut people out. They actually create the definition of how people stay in. And here's the one most people don't want to hear, and the one that I think we're most guilty of. A boundary is not real unless you enforce it. Full stop. Period. If you say, I won't tolerate being spoken to like that, and then you tolerate it, your nervous system just learned something dangerous. My words don't matter. And that's how self-worth erodes, especially after addiction, when self-trust is already fragile. And you're actually reinforcing terrible behavior from the person you're trying to create that boundary with. You cannot be trusted. Your brain can't trust what you're saying, and neither can the person who you're saying that to if you don't adhere to your words. The words have to have the action behind it or it will not land. So let me tell you why this is hard post-addiction. Addiction trained us to normalize chaos. Like I said in the last episode, confuse intensity with connection. This was a huge one for me, especially in the beginning when I was trying to navigate new relationships. I was bored because it was quote unquote normal. Like, it almost felt like, oh shit, if I don't feel that toxic connection where like it's in my body and I don't feel desperate, then it must not be love. That's hard. It also trained us to accept behavior we never should have. And it also taught us to override our intuition to keep attachment. So when someone treats us poorly, our brain doesn't say that's unacceptable. It says, oh, this feels really familiar, and familiar can feel safer than healthy, but that doesn't mean it's true. And I think there's a lot of you that are listening that even already understand this, and maybe some of you are way ahead of the curve here, but there might be some of you in your early days. And for me, it was years before I started thinking about this and understanding that I was responsible for orchestrating my environment. So the shift that actually matters here, our boundaries aren't about becoming rigid or cold. They're about becoming self-responsible. It's realizing I don't need to change you. I need to trust myself. And that trust isn't built through insight. It's built through follow through. So I'll close with this. If boundaries feel uncomfortable, shaky, or awkward, you're not doing it wrong. What you're feeling is absolutely normal because you're doing something new in a system that learned survival through self-abandonment. And you know what that deserves? It deserves grace and patience. And we're all in this together. And I think we're all struggling. Because we hear this word boundary and it's like, okay, but what do I do with that? Well, in the next couple episodes, I'm going to talk a little bit more about boundaries, what they actually are, and how to start feeling the reward of creating boundaries and how that will build your self-worth. Again, boundaries aren't about controlling how people treat you. They're about deciding what you're willing to live with and accept. If something in this episode felt a little too familiar, don't brush past that. That's where the work starts. Healing isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to look at what's real. If you're in that space, stay with me. Follow, share, or come back when you're ready. This is Addictive Personalities.